Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 549. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about castles and the Royal Mile, Jacobites, and haggis as we go to Scotland.
I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. A little bit of news, I'll tell you more at the end, but it looks like we're going to pull the plug on the Amateur Traveler trip to Japan this year. But first, let's talk about Scotland. I'd like to welcome the show Sarah from girlwiththemaptattoo.com, who has come to talk to us about Scotland. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Do you, in fact, have a map tattoo?
I do.
Well,
it's
good.
on my left wrist.
I see. Oh, so it's not one of those that covers your whole back and gets really painful when you have to fill in the countries that you go, and then you go someplace like Russia.
No, it's kind of like a nice bracelet.
I see. Good to know. Why are we talking about Scotland? Why should someone go to Scotland?
Well, I spent a couple of years in Scotland. I lived there for about a year and a half, and I've spent upwards of 4 months there as well.
And I'm assuming we're sending people to Scotland for the weather.
No, not the weather. If you're there in May, though, it's maybe you get a nice sunny week.
Okay.
But the rain makes everything so green. Mm-hmm. It's quite a bit more moody. It's just like Ireland. Very green, very moody. The rain makes it beautiful. It's not fun to wander around the cities in the rain, but it certainly makes the landscape and the Highlands stunning.
So why are we sending people to Scotland?
We are sending people to Scotland because it's a country with an incredibly rich history, a ton of outdoor activities, incredible music, culture, art, and it's small. So you can get around Scotland in a week if you wanted to. You can see the highlights. If you want to add an extra week on that, you can add some of the islands in, or you can do a little bit more on the mainland. So it's a perfect vacation for someone who doesn't have a lot of time but wants to see a lot.
And what kind of itinerary would you recommend for a week to 2 weeks?
Can only fly into one of two cities from the US, Edinburgh or Glasgow. They're only 45 minutes apart by train, so it doesn't matter which one. I tell people fly with your preferred carrier. Delta flies to Edinburgh, American and United and all that fly into Glasgow. So whoever you've got miles with, doesn't matter. Stay in either city for a night. Stay in Edinburgh for 2 nights. You're going to get in, you're going to be tired. You get in the morning, so you'll have a full day, but you'll still be tired. So take an extra day. You've got the castle in Edinburgh, you've got the Royal Mile, you have Holyrood Palace, you have Arthur's Seat if you want to do any hiking. And then you've got the Docklands area in Leith, and that's a really good spot for a night out. Really great restaurants, really good little wine bars, and it's an up-and-coming area. And you'll want a night to explore that. I'd recommend a day in Glasgow, and one overnight in Glasgow, and then up into the Highlands. Get past Loch Lomond, do Fort William. The beaches at Malig and Arisaig are absolutely stunning. You'll feel like you're in the Caribbean. White sand, just gorgeous blue. If you weren't standing there in jeans and boots and 3 sweatshirts, you would definitely feel like you were on a Caribbean island.
Okay.
And then from there, head north up to Inverness, spend a day up in Inverness, and get out onto Loch Ness, look for Loch Ness Monster, Nessie, and then drive back through the Cairngorms into Aberdeen and Perth down towards St. Andrews. Spend an overnight in St. Andrews in the Old Town, and then back into either Edinburgh or Glasgow the night before your flight.
Cool. Well, let's do that then in a little more detail. You started us in Edinburgh, so we'll start there. You named a number of different things that we're seeing while we're in Edinburgh. First of all, how do you say the name of the city?
Okay, well, my Scottish accent is pretty abysmal, but Edinburgh.
Okay.
So you're not saying Edinburgh. That GH is pretty silent. So Edinburgh or Edinburgh would be fine.
Okay. And what are you recommending we see in Edinburgh?
You are going to see, well, the big things. Well, Edinburgh is obviously the capital of Scotland. So the Parliament is there. That's a new building, early 2000s, I would say. And you can take tours. I've never been inside, but it is across the street from Holyrood Palace, which is the royal family seat there. And when they're not in residence, you can take a tour. That's been around for centuries. Bonnie Prince Charlie stayed there, plotted a lot of his little schemes trying to take over from Holyrood Palace and Edinburgh Castle. Now, Edinburgh Castle has been around for a very, very, very long time. The earliest stuff goes back to the 5th and the 6th centuries, and that's the dominant thing on the Edinburgh skyline. So if you see a picture of Edinburgh, you see the castle. It's up on a volcanic hill, and it's very defendable. You can only get to it from one side, and that's the Royal Mile side. So you're approached from Holyrood Palace, which is at the bottom of the Royal Mile, up to Edinburgh Castle. It's a really great walk, very historical. It's very easy to spend a whole day doing something like that. A tour of Edinburgh Castle is definitely worth it.
And we should tell people that the ambiance we're hearing is that Sarah is in a hostel in Australia, so enjoy this lovely sounds of hostel travel.
Yeah, it's silent now. All right. So Edinburgh Castle. They are open every day except Christmas from 9:30 to 5. A guided tour of the castle is included in the entry ticket, so it's well worth taking an actual tour. They take place throughout the day, and they actually just meet right inside. But if you're more keen to just walk around by yourself, that's fine. There are a few highlights in the castle that you absolutely should see. The oldest building in the castle was built in the 12th century, the early 12th century, and that's St. Margaret's Chapel. That actually was kind of discovered again. They were using it as ammunition storage or something when it was finally rediscovered, and it was realized that it was a chapel in one of the oldest places in the current castle. The other one is the Mons Meg. Now that is a gun. It's actually quite large. It was given to King James in the 15th century. It can fire up to 2 miles away. There's also a couple of the military museums in the castle, and that's worth looking at as well. Those are run by the Scottish Army. The whole castle is run by the government under Historic Scotland. So they maintain the castle, and the army is in charge of the military museums.
Any thoughts on visiting the castle for the tattoo?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
what is the tattoo? Since you are the girl with the map tattoo,
Yes.
this has nothing to do with that.
The Edinburgh Tattoo is a military festival.
Mm-hmm.
It's very cool to see. So they do perform at the Edinburgh Castle. It takes place in August every year. It's part of the Edinburgh Festival. It's no longer just Scottish military. It's the British Armed Forces. It's international bands. You're going to get a lot of pipes and drums. Very, very, very cool to watch. Highly recommend it if you can get tickets for it. For people wondering what a tattoo is, it comes from a Dutch phrase, which was played to signal to tavern owners to turn off their kegs so the soldiers would go to bed.
I love that that's the way you tell soldiers to go to bed, is you turn off the kegs.
Well, it must have worked, although I don't know much about the Dutch army, so...
Yeah. And then you were going to move on from the castle.
Yes. So from the castle, I would say start at the castle with your itinerary and head down the Royal Mile. Presumably you've spent a couple of hours at the castle, so wander along the street, stop into one of the pubs for lunch, just your basic pub lunch.
And you've called it the Royal Mile, but you haven't told people what they're going to see on that mile.
These days the Royal Mile is the tourist drag.
Mm-hmm.
It's the main street.
You're going to see T-shirt shops
and people playing the bagpipes in kilts outside of those tourist shops. Yes, exactly. Back in the day, it was the main road. Mm-hmm. And to an extent, it still is. The old town has very much grown up around it, and then the new town has obviously grown up around the old town. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of history there. The closes, and those are very tiny alleyways that go down. People live on those, and you could have hundreds of people in a very, very tiny space. If you go into them, nowadays they're underground, but you look up and you're looking up at a 6 or 7 story building that is 6 or 7 stories underground. And that's how people lived. Back in the day, you could go from the Royal Mile through a close down to the gardens. That is not an option anymore, although in a couple of them, you can wind your way through and get out towards the National Galleries. But otherwise, they're closed off. So you're on the Royal Mile, bagpipes everywhere, guys in kilts everywhere. You feel like you're in Scotland, right? You're going to jump into a pub. You're going to have very traditional lunch. It's fish and chips or a nice hearty stew and a beer. And then keep going down the Royal Mile in Holyrood Palace. So Holyrood Palace is the seat of the royal family, current royal family. It's also very, very, very full of history. It's been the residence of the kings and queens of Scotland since the 16th century. The current building was built around the 16th century. Prior to that, it was Abbey's very small complex of stone buildings. And it's much more ornate now. As far as history goes, you've got a lot of royal weddings that have happened down there, a lot of royal babies that were born there. And there's also some cemeteries where you have James II is buried there. Some of the Tudor family is buried there.
And when you say James II, you're using the English numbering system because he's James II of England and James VII of Scotland. That's the guy we're talking about?
Yeah. He's the son of James I.
Right.
And
James
Joan
I of England, James VI of Scotland, right.
Yeah. And then, of course, as I said, in the 1700s, Bonnie Prince Charlie took over Holyrood Palace, and that's where he did a lot of his plotting for trying to take over the whole Jacobite Rising in 45. And if anyone is an Outlander fan, you'll know all about it. The second season covered a bit of France and a bit of Holyrood Palace. So you've probably seen some of that if you're watching the show. And after that, it just kind of fell into neglect. And finally, in the 19th century, there were repairs ordered to the palace and slowly made into the palace that it is today.
Okay.
And you can take tours of it. It is managed by the Royal Trust. Revenues from entry tickets are still supporting the work. And they're looking at the moment to update the outdoor space and the grounds. That will be really interesting. It should be beautiful. It's a beautiful building, but updating the grounds should make it a lot prettier, especially since the royal family doesn't spend too much time there. Just across from Holyrood House, you do have the Parliament building. And as I mentioned earlier, you can take tours of that. If you're not interested in taking a tour, or if you just want to pop into the entry and have a look around, it's a modern piece of architecture. So it's very different from what Holyrood is. You've got this old stone buildings across from this brand new wood and steel building. Really interesting juxtaposition architecture-wise, but I don't really recommend taking a tour of it. It's just a Parliament building, but nice to look at. But across from Holyrood and in the Queen's Gardens is Arthur's Seat. Now, Arthur's Seat is another volcanic crag that sits in the center of Edinburgh, and it's not quite as tall as the Castle Crag, but it's a nice hike, and you have an absolutely stunning view back over the old town. It takes about an hour to hike up. Beautiful view from the top. Definitely recommend doing that. And then once you've come down, just head to a nearby pub, and you've definitely earned a whiskey.
Any recommendations for, we had a beer earlier and a whiskey now, any recommendations when we're in Scotland for what the right one to drink is?
Oh, the right one. Okay. I'm going to make some enemies here.
Yes, you are, if you answer that question.
It just depends on what you like. I'm partial to the more mellow whiskeys. Highland Park, Talisker, and Oban are some of my favorites.
Okay.
But I've got friends that swear by Lefroy, and that is the one in the green bottle. Everybody knows it. Green bottle, white label, that when it's opened a mile away, you can smell it.
Okay.
Now, there are some whiskey bars in Edinburgh, very appropriately called the Whiskey Bar. You're going to find very knowledgeable staff at any of those whiskey bars. That's kind of one of the things. When you climbed off of Arthur's Seat, head to a whiskey bar and taste a couple different things. Get a feel for what you like, because later in your trip, you are going to be going to a distillery or 2 or 6.
Okay.
It would help to know what your interests are when it comes to whiskey and taste.
All right. Do we need to do anything else in Edinburgh? Is it time now for us to head north?
It is time to take the train to Glasgow.
Okay.
So getting between Edinburgh and Glasgow, as I said, 45 minutes by train from city centre to city centre. Very, very, very easy. Now, Glasgow is a bit smaller, especially in the city centre. The biggest things in Glasgow are going to be the Charles Rennie Mackintosh architecture. Now, he was an architect, along with his wife and a few other people, in and around the 1900s, really, late 1800s, early 1900s. He was actually started out as an artist and then slowly kind of moved into the architecture, Art Nouveau, arts and crafts style. The building he is most well known for is the Glasgow School of Art. It's a beautiful building. I actually studied in the building in the top floor, which was, as an architecture student, you're sitting there saying, wow, Charles Rennie Mackintosh lived in this building. He worked in this building. He stared out that same window that I'm staring out now. It's very cool. Sadly, you can't take tours of the school at the moment. There was a fire in 2014, destroyed the library, which was probably the part of the building that he was most well known for. And at the moment, it is still under restoration. It's beautiful to see from the outside, and you might be able to walk inside. I went in, but I had friends that were studying there still, and so I just went in and visited. As just a random passerby, I hesitate to say that you probably could go in because it's still unlikely. But definitely walk up to that. It's on Renfrew Street, just off the city center.
Okay. And we're recording this in 2017, so if you're listening to it much later, then you probably have a better chance.
Absolutely, yeah. If you're listening to this in a couple of years, you're highly likely to get in and definitely do it. It is very much worth it. You can also take walking tours in the city that focus on the Rennie Mackintosh architecture. So there's the Lighthouse, which is in the city center. That was the original newspaper building. Very tall, skinny building, lots of stairs, beautiful lookout point from the top. You can climb out to the roof and get a nice 360 panorama of the city. But they also host a lot of museum exhibits there on the ground floor and the second and third floors. So that's a well worth visiting, and that's just off the Prince's Mall on Buchanan Street, and there is a subway stop on Buchanan Street. So if you're staying a little bit out, it's pretty accessible. And the only other thing in Glasgow that I highly recommend is the Kelvingrove Museum and the university. They're both in the West End, a little bit out of the city centre, but just jump on the subway and go around to either the Kelvingrove or the Hillhead stops. Now, the Kelvingrove is a very unique museum. It's got everything. It is entirely the most eclectic museum I've come across in my life. They've got taxidermy, they've got old airplanes, they had an Elvis exhibit the last time I was there, and they have several Dali paintings, in addition to an entire exhibit on Robert Burns, or Rabbie Burns, as the Scots say, an exhibit on Bonnie Prince Charlie, Impressionist watercolors, and a whole host of more. So very interesting museum. Easily could spend a couple hours there. And from there, just walk up through Kelvin Way, very beautiful tree-lined street through the park, and it will take you to just below the university. Now, I recommend the university. I might be a little bit biased because I did spend a year and a half there, but it's the second oldest university in Scotland. Started in 1451, and the current building actually is a little bit older than that. The current building is 1800s, but that was designed by Gilbert Scott, and he's a pretty famous architect. He's done a few other buildings. That's in the West End now on Gilmore Hill, and I recommend wandering through the main building. You can walk straight in. No one's going to stop you. The cloisters and the two quadrangles are beautiful, and then the tower is something that you can actually see from the city center. Mm-hmm. Just a quick stop in, because that's on your way to Byers Road. Just stop in, look at the building, take a few photos, and then keep heading towards Byers Road. And Byers Road is the main thoroughfare in the West End, and that's where you're going to find some fantastic restaurants, some cute little boutique shopping, and one of my favorite places in Glasgow, Ashton Lane.
And you mentioned restaurants. Are there particular restaurants you would recommend as long as we're there?
Absolutely. So Ashton Lane is a tiny cobblestone lane, and it's pretty much all bars and restaurants. Mm-hmm. Two of my favorites happen to be in Ashton Lane. One is called the Ubiquitous Chip. That is, it's just traditional British food. Fish and chips, pies, good beer, good wine list, good whiskey list. They have a tiny little rooftop patio, very, very thin and narrow. You can maybe get 15 to 20 people up there, and there's no tables, so that's definitely a drinking spot. But definitely go for the restaurant, go for dinner, and then stay for a few drinks. The second one that I really like is called Café Andaluz, and they have one in the city center, and they have one in Edinburgh as well. It's a Spanish tapas restaurant, and I go every time I'm in town. And if we're on the topic of food, there are a few other restaurants in Glasgow that I can recommend.
Now, people may be surprised that you recommended a tapas place rather than a place for haggis. My impression is that the food scene in Scotland is a little more diverse than it may have been 20, 30 years ago.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you get the chance to try haggis, do. It's interesting. It's not as bad as everyone says it is. And we're actually, Chris, interestingly enough, for me anyway, it's January 26th. So it's Robbie Burns Day in Scotland.
Oh my, yeah.
And yeah. So I guess, should we explain who Robbie Burns is?
It might be useful to explain who he is and what Burns Night is. Okay.
So Robert Burns, or Rabbie Burns, was a Scottish poet. Now, he's 18th century under the Romantic movement, mm-hmm. and he's highly, highly, highly revered in Scotland. He's definitely a cultural icon, but he's also a little bit of a political icon in Scotland. You may not know most of his stuff, but the one that everyone will know is Auld Lang Syne. Mm-hmm. So he's the writer of Auld Lang Syne. And Robbie Burns Day just celebrates him. It is his birthday, it's actually January 25th. So that is today for you, not today for me.
That is correct.
And on Robbie Burns Day, it's a rather interesting night. You have a dinner for him, mm-hmm. and you have a haggis. There's a lot that goes along with this. They call it a Burns supper. Mm-hmm. There's an order to how this goes. You have to say the address to the haggis. You also have Scottish whiskey, and you recite the poetry. I'm actually just going to read this in the order and say a little bit about it. You have the piping in, which you have a bagpiper, very standard traditional Scottish music. He greets the guests. Then the host has a welcoming speech. And then they say the Selkirk Grace. That is a Thanksgiving said before meals. It is attributed to Burns, but it actually was already known before him. But he is said to have delivered it at a dinner to the Earl of Selkirk. Again, my Scottish accent, not so great, but some have meat I cannot eat, and some would eat that want it. But we have meat, and we can eat, and say the Lord be thanked. So after the Selkirk Grace, you have a soup course. Now, Scottish soups, you're looking at things like Scotch broth, potato soup, or Cullen skink. And Cullen skink is delicious. It's a seafood soup, perfect on rainy nights. Generally, January is quite rainy. Now, after the soup course, that's when the haggis is served. So at a Burns supper, everyone stands when the haggis is brought in. The piper plays the bagpipe and leads the way in front of the haggis, where they've set the haggis in front of the host. Then you have the address to the haggis. Now, it's quite long, so I'm not going to read this one.
Thank you.
But at the end of the poem, the speaker will take a knife and he plunges it into the haggis and cuts that open. And that's the ceremony of the evening. And then everyone eats the haggis after a whiskey toast. So, of course, you have to have whiskey at a haggis Burns night. And haggis is traditionally served with neeps and tatties. And those are mashed turnips and mashed potatoes. So if anyone asks if you want haggis, neeps, and tatties, that's what you're going to get. And then afterwards, dessert, cheese course, coffee, dessert, and then the toasts. There's various toasts, and you don't need to do all of them. The two that are done most often would be the address to the lassies, which is given by a male guest in thanks to the women who've prepared the meal. That was the traditional way. Now it tends to be a little more funny. It generally covers more modern views on women. So I haven't been to a Burns supper in a long time, so I'd be really curious to see what they say these days. The men drink a toast to the women. So after the address to the lassies, the ladies or the lassies get to reply to the laddies. Generally, it's just a reply to any specific points, maybe gives her views on men. Again, should be rather interesting. And neither one of these should be offensive. But generally, they complement each other. They'll usually know who's doing the speech, and they'll collaborate a little bit beforehand. And then after that, you have singing of songs, poetry by Burns. A Burns supper can go on as long as people want. It could go on for hours, especially if you have foreign guests, because they may be invited to share poetry or songs from their own country. And then finally, when everyone's had enough whiskey, the host will either give a vote of thanks or call on someone to give a vote of thanks. And then they sing Auld Lang Syne, and that is your night over. So that is Burns supper.
Excellent. And in terms of, you mentioned Burns supper, is that a good time of year to go to Scotland? I know you're not going to find the best weather if you go and happen to be there at that time of year.
It's January, so no, it's not a good time to go to Scotland. People don't realize how far north Scotland actually is. It's not on the latitude of, say, New York.
Right,
it's
exactly.
on latitude of more like Nova Scotia and further north. So it's actually really dark. After living there for a year and a half and spending a winter there, I definitely understand seasonal affective disorder. It got light at 9 o'clock and it got dark at 3 or 4 p.m. You could go. As any European destination, there are very few tourists in the winter in general. You'll find that things are not crowded. You may find that people have taken an extensive holiday, though, and are closed for the month of January. And you're only going to get a few hours of daylight. And then it's going to be very gray daylight and wet daylight. I would recommend going to Scotland in May or June. You'll have the best weather. You will have the most sun. So we're looking at the summer solstice then. Late May and the month of June, early July. That's about your 2-month frame for going.
Okay. Anything else we want to do in Glasgow before we head up into the Highlands?
No, we are heading to the Highlands. There's a couple different ways to get to the Highlands. The Glasgow to Fort William and Mallaig train is one of the best in the world, view-wise. So if you don't have a car, definitely take the train. If anyone's a Harry Potter fan, the viaduct that you see in the movies that the train goes over, that bridge, that's the Glenfinnan Viaduct. Now, the last time I was there, my mom befriended the conductor, and we were in the last car. And as we went over that viaduct, my mom ended up in the very back driver's cab that wasn't being used, hanging out the window, taking photos of this viaduct. So, of course, I did the same thing. A beautiful, beautiful train ride. It goes up along the shore of Loch Lomond. Now, if you've got extra time, if you're not there for just a week, definitely explore Loch Lomond as well. There's some wonderful hiking in that region. That's part of the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, and it's only about an hour north of Glasgow. But since our itinerary doesn't leave time for that, we're just going to go past it on the train. So once you get up to Fort William, hang out there, but go to Mallaig, and that is where we're going to stay just overnight. The beaches are there at Arasag, and that's where I was talking about those white, sandy Caribbean beaches.
With 3 sweatshirts.
Yes, with 3 sweatshirts. And Mallaig is where you catch the ferry across to the Isle of Skye. You've taken the trains, you're going to want a car on the Isle of Skye. And there are a few car rental companies that will meet you at the ferry and give you the car. And that's what we did the last time. The ferry goes from Mallaig to Armadale, which is on the southern bit of Skye. We got our car there, and we started driving. And we stayed up on the northwest side of Skye. We stayed for 2 nights. And 2 nights definitely enough on the Isle of Skye. If you prefer not to go to the Isle of Skye, definitely don't have to. You can stay in Mallaig or in Fort William and explore further south in Glencoe.
To help people make that decision, what are they going to see on the Isle of Skye? Why would you choose to do it or not?
The Isle of Skye is very quintessentially Scotland. It's magical, it's mystical, it's always raining, phenomenal hiking. The scenery is absolutely stunning. You absolutely should do some hiking in the Cuillins, the mountain range on the Isle of Skye, and drive through or hike at the Quiraing. Scotland is very volcanic, so you're going to get a lot of these high ridges. And the one on Skye that is most famous is the Trotternish Ridge. The Quiraing is a very tiny road that goes up across the Trotternish Ridge to the other side. A lot of people hike it, a lot of people bike it. It's a 1-lane road, but people go both directions. So you're going to get stuck. People are going to be trying to pass you in their camper van, but it's worth it. The views from the top are unsurpassable, and it's really unique. I've never seen anything like it in New Zealand or in the rest of Scotland. It's very hard to describe, but it's very, very unique and very worth it.
And I'm going to make you try a little harder to describe it. So it's very green. It's craggy.
It's very craggy. And it's green if it's been raining.
Okay. It looks like a fair amount of uplift where big rocks are turned up on their diagonals and things like that.
Yes. So imagine that an earthquake's happened and half of your land has gone up by 20 meters. And you're looking at it down that ridge where you're staring at a flat bit and then this very high bit and then cliffs. It's basically inland cliffs of Moher from Ireland. There's just not water on the one side.
That was a better description. Thank you.
Okay, great. You can actually hike the entire thing, all of Skye, if you wanted to. So anyone listening who's a hiker and you want to plan a hiking trip, plenty to do. You'll just want to plan for 4 or 5 days in each place to do things.
Okay. And my impression is that the hike here in particular is a little strenuous, that you ought to be in good shape before you do this one.
Yes.
This is not a walk.
It's not a walk.
Okay.
No, it is definitely a proper hike. And no accommodation, so you do need to camp.
Okay. Excellent. So we may choose that, and then you were going to give us another option if we didn't.
If you're not hiking, or if you aren't interested in seeing the Quiraing, Skye is very much outdoors and looking at historical pieces, natural things. The Old Man of Storr is a rock that looks like an old man. Very popular hike. Do it in about an hour. If no one is interested in hiking, there's a lot of old inns on the Isle of Skye, and there's also a lot of art galleries. They do have what's called the Arts Trail, and that's put on by the Skye and the Loch Alsh Arts and Crafts Association. And there's probably by now 30 to 50 galleries on the trail. Some of them are shops, some of them are just galleries, but you've got everything from ceramics to painting to crafts to photography. And a lot of these galleries also have cafes. If you are driving and you're following the Arts Trail, by the way, you can pick up a brochure for the Arts Trail in any of the visitor centers on Skye or in Glasgow or in Edinburgh. And that will give you a map, and it will break it down by region, because Skye it's not large, but there are different neighborhoods to it. So if you're planning on being in one particular area and you want to focus on that area, you'll already know what's there from the maps. But if you are driving around and you get a little bit of a craving for tea, you've got a couple options. You can go to a pub, they'll have tea, they'll have coffee. You can go to a very nice restaurant. There's a lot of luxury lodges on the Isle of Skye, a lot of Michelin-starred restaurants. These are all very new. I've never stayed at any of them. But you're looking at very, very, very high-end lodges and restaurants that chefs and luxury lodge owners have decided to open up on Skye because of the unparalleled scenery. The feeling that you are kind of away from everything, but you are still connected to Scotland by a bridge.
Okay.
So you can kind of feel like you're out in the middle of nowhere, but you're very close otherwise to the city. And if you needed to get back quickly, you could. I don't know why you would, though. Skye is beautiful. But if you're not planning on stopping at a pub or stopping at a very high-end restaurant, any of these galleries have places where you can sit and have a scone and tea. And you can wander around and look at the art while you're sitting there sipping your tea. And they usually have great views as well.
Where to next?
Well, we're going to leave Skye. Actually, we're not going to leave Skye. I have one thing to say about it, and I cannot tell you where it is, but it's beautiful. You need to ask a local. It's kind of a secret. But before you leave the Isle of Skye, find the Fairy Glen.
Okay.
I'll give you a bit of a hint. It's on the northwest side, so a lot of people don't get up that way. But the people that do, you'll know what I mean when I say Fairy Glen. Ask a local about it. A little secret spot.
Okay, I'm seeing that it's in the hills above the town of UIG.
Yes. It is.
There's no secrets anymore now that there's the internet. But
Still, the best way to find it is to ask a local about it.
I suspect I'd get a little more of a story if I ask a local.
Yeah, you would. You'd hear all about the little people that live there.
Okay.
So from the Isle of Skye, we're crossing over to Inverness. You know, most people will hear Inverness and they think Nessie, they think not much else, but you'd be actually surprised. Inverness is the capital of the Highlands. It has a beautiful castle overlooking the river. It also has the Moray Firth. So if you are a fisherman or someone who's interested in water, that estuary is absolutely beautiful. It also gets a lot of birds. So anyone who's a birder, worth it to go up to Inverness and explore where the River Ness meets the Firth. But of course, the main thing to do in Inverness is definitely to take a cruise down the river, down the canal, into Loch Ness to Urquhart Castle. And you can do that with Jacobite Cruise Company. From Inverness, you can either go by coach down to the castle and then by boat back to town, or from town by boat and then back into town by coach after you've explored the castle. I'll just tell you a little bit about the castle itself. It's right on the main road, so if you are driving in, you will see it. It's about 13, 15 miles south of Inverness. It's a ruined castle. Don't expect beautiful interiors that you'll see in some of the other country homes in Scotland and other castles. They are ruins, and they date from about the 13th to the 16th century. So it played Urquhart which is Urquhart, Urquhart, played a role in the Wars of Scottish Independence. It also played roles in a lot of the raids by various Highland clans. It unfortunately was destroyed to prevent use by the Jacobites. And now people might be wondering who the Jacobites are, actually, Chris. I'll give a quick, brief synopsis of that. Jacobite, which is the English word, of course, but you're looking at son of James. And so we go back to that whole James II, James I. These are people who believed that their King James was the proper king of England and Scotland, and they were fighting for that. So Bonnie Prince Charlie was James' son. Now, James's followers, in 1715, put up a revolution to get him back on the throne, and that was quelled by English forces. And then in 1745, which is probably the more popular, the more well-known revolution, was Bonnie Prince Charlie, and they wanted Bonnie Prince Charlie on the throne. And then, of course, we all know Battle of Culloden, the suppression of the Highland clans by the English. Then you're looking at all through the 1800s, the clans, basically, you're not allowed to wear tartan, which is the plaid that a kilt is made out of. Very, very hard time in Scotland for those clans. And again, if you've read Outlander, you have a huge backlog of knowledge there as to what that was, because Diana Gabaldon has done a great job of explaining it. Anyone who was even seen with a bit of plaid could be killed. English forces ran rampant through the Highlands, killing anyone they suspected of treason. Families completely torn apart by war, fields and farms destroyed by the English, a lot of famine as well. So really hard time for Scotland, and kind of a little bit of symbolism for the clans now. But we don't want to talk about that. It's sad. But that's where the Jacobite term comes from, and you will see that a lot in especially the Northern Highlands towards Inverness.
Well, and when we talk about the Jacobites and wanting James' relatives back on the throne, remember James II, or James the Seventh of Scotland, is right around the time of the English Revolution. So basically this is when the Protestants take over, and then eventually you end up with a Protestant king on the throne, William III, who comes over from Netherlands and such. So there's a real question about who should be on the throne here, and a different lineage does come in at around that time. So
yes. Yeah, and of course it's been a matter of debate between the English and the Scottish for even hundreds of years before that, with looking at Henry VII and the Yorks and the Lancasters, because there was a lot of Scottish blood in that as well. So, but that's a history lesson, and getting a little bit off topic here.
Excellent. We're getting to a long episode here. Anything else we want to cover in our itinerary before we get to our summary questions?
Well, I'll just say one more thing about Inverness. After you've done the castle, I mentioned Culloden. That is the battlefield, and that has a new visitor center. When I was there in 2009, that was under construction. So brand new visitor center, and it's a field, okay? But it is very sombering to see, because after we've just talked about the Jacobites, you get a feel for Culloden and what it was like to be on that battlefield. That's your last thing in Inverness. Then head back to wherever you flew out of. You have one night there, and then your flight back to the States is the following morning. So you'll want to be in town before the flight.
Excellent. Now, when we talk about times of year to go, one thing you mentioned we didn't get any detail on was when we were talking about the tattoo, you said it was during the time of the Edinburgh Festival.
Yes. Now that is in August. And I did say May to July is a great time to go.
Right.
May is still spring. It depends on your preferences. If you prefer less people, May is a great time to go. You will find that graduation happens. So the universities and the hotels around the university will be pretty busy, but it's also watching a graduation is a pretty unique thing at both the University of Glasgow and the University of Edinburgh. The ceremonies are in Latin, and there's a lot of processionals and bagpipes. So if you are interested in something like that, it's a great time to go. June, July, and August does start to get a little bit chillier, but still nice. It's still not raining constantly. Once you get out of August, you're definitely looking at more of late fall, spring weather. But it is not uncommon to get all 4 seasons in one day, even in July. So it doesn't matter what time of year you're going. Pack a raincoat, pack a pair of long pants, pack some sturdy shoes.
Of all the places we talked about, you're standing in the prettiest spot. Where are you standing? What are you looking at?
Oh, the Isle of Skye.
Okay. Any particular place? You mentioned the Fairy Glen. You mentioned some of the other places. What's your favorite?
For the views, you're standing at the Quiraing in the Trotternish Ridge.
Okay.
For something where you're totally alone and you're just reveling in the landscape, the Fairy Glen.
Okay. So I've not been to Scotland, but I watch a lot of TV, so I know everything about Scotland, right? It's always about haggis and bagpipes. And what is going to surprise me when I go to Scotland?
For me, I came over as a student. I was expecting everything to be the same as it was at home because it's an English-speaking country.
Sort of.
Sort of. My surprises came from the fact that getting a bank account was a 5-day deal. There's no late night shops or big late night shops. You know, your grocery stores aren't 24 hours. If you're traveling as a family or as a couple and you prefer to do self-catering, so an Airbnb or a hostel, your grocery stores aren't open at midnight. If you forget something, you're kind of out of luck till the next morning, unless you've got a little corner shop and they're not going to have the selection of stuff that you might want. You're also not going to be able to buy everything at one place. So coming from the land of Target and Walmart, you know, I went to the grocery store and I wanted my groceries, but I also wanted toiletries and I needed X, Y, and Z, and I couldn't buy it. I couldn't buy plates for my kitchen. I couldn't buy wine glasses. So that was shocking to me.
So you hadn't done a lot of traveling before you went over there, too, it sounds like.
I had traveled with my family, so I hadn't really done anything on my own. This is the first time I'd actually gone away. No, it was the second time I'd gone away by myself. And I was still very young. I was 19. The one thing I would say about Scotland for anyone who has not been is that the people are undeniably friendly. They are so nice. They'll help you out with anything. I managed to get myself lost on Orkney one time. I was looking for a hiking trail, couldn't find it, was wandering through cow pastures. I was so upset. I couldn't find my way to where I knew I needed to go. I could see where I needed to be, but I couldn't figure out how to get there. And this woman drove past me, and I flagged her down. And I'm in tears, and I'm trying to explain my story. And she's like, get in my car. I'm going to take you to the bus station. She drove me 20 minutes to the bus station and was like, they'll tell you how to get to where you need to go. I was like, okay, thank you. And of course, I'd been trying to hike it, but in the end, that was just not going to happen. So they'll help you out with anything. Another surprising thing was that the amount of tourists in Edinburgh actually does rival that of Paris and Venice and Rome. A lot of people go to Edinburgh, and they go for the castle, they go for the Holyrood Palace and Arthur's Seat. I hadn't expected that because I knew a lot of people that had been in Europe and had never been to Scotland. So that was very surprising that there were actually a lot of people there. On the flip side, after I got back to the States, and even still now, 10 years later, telling people that I lived in Glasgow, they said, oh, I've never been. I've been to Scotland 3 times. I've never been to Glasgow. That's the one thing I will say to everybody. Go to Glasgow. It's very, very, very different from Edinburgh. And it's beautiful in its own way.
One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Scotland.
You'll never understand anyone. Ever. Everyone talks about British humor, right? It's very dry. Scottish humor is the same, but expect a little bit more inappropriateness in that the old men at the pubs are fantastic. And if you're a girl, they will call you a hen. So that's where the hen party comes from, bachelorette party. So you will get called hen quite a bit. And it's not a derogatory term. They'll call you a hen if you're 16, and they'll call you a hen if you're 75. So never come across a country where that one word kind of encompasses an entire gender, but it really does.
And anything else we want to tell people before we get to my last two questions?
Scotland is a beautiful country, and you're going to get out of the city, you'll see the Highlands, you'll see Inverness. But if you've got the time and if you're interested in it, it's very worth it to take a ferry over to Orkney or fly from Inverness to Kirkwall and explore the Orkney Islands, or to catch the ferry from the Isle of Skye and do the Outer Hebrides. They are both still Scotland, but they are completely different, and I know very few people, even those people that say I've been to Scotland 3 times, have never been to the Outer Hebrides or even the Inner Hebrides or Orkney. So that would be one of my biggest recommendations, is take an extra week and add the islands onto your itinerary, if you can.
Finish this thought. You really know you're in Scotland when what?
When it's raining. It sounds terrible, and it's true. When it's raining and someone's playing the bagpipes on the street corner, and there's a very cozy-looking whiskey bar around the corner.
I feel like you are feeding all of my Scottish stereotypes all within that.
Well, yes, because that's what people think of Scotland. And the bagpipes, to be sure, are very much Scotland. The other thing I could say is, you're standing in the Highlands and you're staring up at this incredible mountain in front of you, but you could also be in New Zealand for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And in the cities, Glasgow is kind of a world city. Edinburgh is your history city. So you're really in Scotland when you're standing at the gates of Edinburgh Castle looking down the Royal Mile. That's it.
Okay. And if you had to summarize Scotland in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
We're going to go with friendly,
Okay.
historic,
Okay.
and beautiful.
Excellent. And I appreciate you using the word historic rather than historically correctly. Our guest again has been Sarah from girlwiththemaptattoo.com. Sarah, do you have a particular post on your blog that we should read to get a view of Scotland?
So I've done a few posts on Scotland. If you're looking for things to do in Glasgow or Edinburgh, I have 2. They are aptly entitled 25 Things to Do in Glasgow and 25 Things to Do in Edinburgh. And that's a list of free things from hiking or museums to paid tours, for example, Edinburgh Castle.
Excellent. We'll put a link to both of those in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. Sarah, thank you for coming on the show and sharing with us your obvious love for Scotland.
Thank you for having me, Chris. It was great talking with you.
As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, it looks like we're going to pull the plug on the trip to Japan this year in June. We're still going to be doing the trip to India in November. We've just had much more interest in the India trip than we have in the Japan trip, and we just didn't meet the minimums, and therefore it looks like trying to do 2 trips in 1 year was a bit too much. Which is sad, because next week we're going to have a great episode on Tokyo, and you're going to be begging me to go to Japan. So what are you going to do? I was gone in Baja last week on another uncruise, which I think you heard in the re-recorded episode we did. And in this particular cruise, we saw blue whales, and we saw at one time 2,000 to 3,000 dolphins swimming around our boat, as well as seeing the baby gray whales and swimming with sea lions. But we'll be talking about that more probably in a month or 2. I think we're going to do an episode on Baja. In news of the community, I heard from Larry, who wrote about the show we did recently on northern Vietnam. Chris, greetings from Vietnam. You may recall that I reached out to you from Cambodia last year around this time. I was in the middle of an 8-week bicycle tour of Southeastern Asia. I was really interested to hear the podcast on your trip. I had such a good time touring the Mekong Delta last year that I decided to return to Vietnam for a 7-week bicycle tour this year. So I was pleased to hear this week's podcast about northern Vietnam. I agree with your guest that you need to skip Ha Long Bay and Hanoi if you only have 1 week and you want to go to indigenous villages and also Hoi An
Da Bang Hui. That said, however, I would go to Hanoi and skip the Central Coast if I only had a week. Everyone is entitled to an opinion, but your guest is wrong to describe Hanoi as just another Southeastern Asian city. Moreover, to compare Hanoi to Phnom Penh is just plain ignorant. There's a reason why the French chose to locate their capital in Indochina in Hanoi, not Phnom Penh. Hanoi remains one of the best cities on the region. If you're going to tour the indigenous villages, you want to start at the Museum of Ethnography in Hanoi. Aside from this minor quibble, I really enjoyed the episode, which I listened to from Mae Chau in Northwest Vietnam. Keep up the great work. Best regards, Larry. Larry, I loved how you got from everybody has an opinion and yours is wrong so quickly. It sounded like a lot of the debates we're having in American politics these days, but I appreciate yours. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. If you have a chance, leave us an iTunes review. Go to amateurtraveler.com/iTunes, and thanks so much for listening.
Got to see one more.